Welcome to Getting Better with Dr. Adam. Dr. Adam Silberstein is a clinical psychologist who has been working in the field since 1993. With a broad range of clinical experience, including state psychiatric hospitals, adolescent residential treatment with a trauma focus, the Department of Corrections, and in the addiction treatment arena. Adam is currently in private practice and serves as a clinical consultant and supervisor for a number of treatment centers.
Hi, I just met with Jack Soll. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's been around practicing in West Los Angeles since 1988. He has a plethora of experience consulting and working in various eating disorder treatments on all fronts, but that's actually not the good part. The good part for me was this was a really unique opportunity. Both Jack and I are individuals who a long time ago carried the burden of over 100 pounds extra weight. And if you saw both of us today, and I say this in all humility, you wouldn't ever know. And the discussion is about two people who have such a similar story, both in terms of background and in terms of experience, who are practicing therapists in West Los Angeles. And the discussion was, what's it like? What's our understanding of obesity based on experience, but also as professionals, how we could help individuals struggling with the challenge of obesity address the issue and actually heal. So I hope you enjoy it. Hi, I have Jack Soll here. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's been practicing in Southern California since 1988. And that's kind of cool, but that's not what I'm excited about. There are lots of therapists, as we all know. There are many, many therapists on the block that I'm on in West LA. I would say there are probably 1,000 within a 1 mile square radius. So that's not what's interesting to me. Here we have this unique opportunity, and I want to give some background. And this is kind of a blend of a personal story as well as a professional story. So I myself, and I've shared this before, we had David Wiss, registered dietitian, talking about food addiction, something I certainly know in personal experience exists. I'm a person who was once, many years ago, over, 135 pounds heavier, and am living in a healthy body weight for several years. And it's always interesting to me to examine and try to be a resource to people who struggle with the same issue. So here I have with me Jack Soll. Yes, he's a licensed marriage and family therapist. Yes, he has boatloads of experience with working in the eating disorder community on all fronts, right? But to me, what's interesting is we have two therapists. Jack is also someone who is maintaining a 120-pound weight loss for so many years. And we both, and we were talking before, we both do this work. We work with people who have compulsion addiction, but we also have this personal story. And we're thinking about it, how many people do we know, period, who have the story of, and I say this with all humility, and it's a gift. I don't want this to come off in any way, shape, or form like I'm special. I really feel like I've been given a gift and a sort of new lease on life. And here we are. We both practice the same profession, right? We both are in a seat of helping people, and what a unique opportunity there. We were trying to list how many people we know who have this experience of losing the burden of 100 pounds or more, and having this experience of being in a healthy body weight and have a professional seat of being able to help people. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce Jack Soll. Thank you for being here at Getting Better with Dr. Adam.
This is great. Thank you, Adam. I've known you for a while, and I hadn't thought about it in the context of how you've described it. It's a miracle of sorts without being silly or being hokey. It really is rather certainly unusual. When I got into the field in the early '80s, there was a maven, Dr. William Rader, and I think I remember him saying that only 5% of the morbidly obese people ever lose all their weight, and only 5% of them keep it off. So he was saying that came down to 1 out of 400 people. And I don't know that there was science to that, but it was a good ballpark figure.
So I don't have the descriptive statistics, but I know this. I grew up in a Jewish community, and that was definitely the drug of choice. Food was the drug of choice, and there were so many of us who carried this extra weight. And I remember thinking that there was this pool, this 100 pounds or 100 to 150 pounds, and everybody shared it. So when you lose it, I find it, and then and then when I lose it, you find it, and we all rotated. And maybe every so often, one of us would lose the entire weight, the entire amount of weight needed, and then quickly we would find it. I was never the one who was able to lose the weight. I remember a few people in this sea of overweight, morbidly obese individuals. A couple of people lost it, and it lasted for about 5 minutes.
For those who don't relate to that, I was unique in my own community. Ours defined not by religion, but by geography. There were no or very, very, very few other obese people. When I went to elementary school,
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up I was born at Temple Hospital, halfway to Dodger Stadium, and I went to the elementary school right behind Town and Country and the Farmers Market. And in that elementary school, there were, I don't know, 35 people in a class, and I was invariably the second heaviest kid all through elementary school. And we paid a price. And then in junior high, everything got amped up 20, 30, 40%. And the difference in bodies began to show because of PE and changing clothes and all that. And it was brutal. I thank God there was always one, maybe two kids in the school that were heavier, so that some of the burden was absorbed by them. But I paid a price for my weight, emotionally, physically, spiritually.
So you know the story of being the heavy kid, one of the heavier kids. So do I. Tell us a little bit about your experience. When you say it was hard, what do you mean by that?
Well, things changed. When I got to high school in 1967, on Mother's Day of 67, my first semester at Fairfax High School, my mother died. So now I was a member of another group that I didn't know that parents died. I knew that dogs and goldfish died. I knew that grandparents died, but I don't think I'd ever met anybody who had lost a parent. So now I'm fat. I can't tuck my shirt tails in. I've got all the burden of the weight, which by then was 50, 60, 70 pounds. And I've got a secret that my life is different than everybody else's at yet another level. And I worked my way up to, by the time I was a freshman at UCLA in 1970, at 18, just before 18, I weighed 305. And I didn't know anybody else who was that big. My connection with the 2 or 3 obese people from elementary school was gone, and I didn't know anybody. I mean, I looked around the UCLA campus, and nobody looked like me.
Right. I also grew up in Southern California, and I would imagine, and speculating, it's hard to be the heaviest kid in the class anywhere, but particularly on culture that has puts such a high priority and premium on looking good and being fit. It's hard.
And then throw in the cultural component of being a straight male and all that going through the body changes and being defined in large part by, well, in our community, it was academics, but in general, developmentally, it's the body. And so there were sports and high school sports, I'm talking about college sports and fraternities and all that stuff. And I participated at a level, but it became fraught with all of the stigma and all the defenses that obese people many of the defenses that many obese people develop just to survive.
So I'm going to comment on that. For me, it's like there's a big party out there and I'm quasi invited, and I'm invited if I do certain things. So I could be funny, right? I could celebrate being the guy who's good at being out of control, right? But I feel in that, I think back at that person, me and perhaps you, right? And it was such a burden to feel like I'm a part of. So I had to come up with some extra packaging, right? And I didn't want anybody to know. And also that packaging not only got me in the room, but also I had to figure out ways once I'm there for you not to figure out that I'm obese, right?
Right.
Even though I know,
Well-
even though it's the most obvious thing in the room, I don't want you to think about it.
And when I went to there were only 2 stores in this part of town when I was growing up, the big men shops. This is pre the classy ones. There were 2 of them, one by both of them in the direction of Hollywood High School. And they had these people there whose job it was to convince you that with the right color and the right pattern of lines, nobody would notice that you were morbidly obese. And these guys, God bless them, they meant well.
Uh-huh.
And they seemed even sincere, but I even knew it wasn't going to happen. I mean, you can't hide it. You just can't hide it. There was no way around that. And everything. I mean, it affected my dating. One day after my mom died, my dad was washing clothes and he accidentally threw in all of my, I guess they're vests, pullover vests, no sleeves, and they all shrunk. And I couldn't go out that day because I would not go out without it was either jeans with the shirt tails untucked or it was slacks if I had to with a pullover sweater, because I guess I kind of figured if you covered it, maybe people wouldn't see it or notice it. And humor is by far, it saved my life. I mean, I was funny. I was invited to places I believe I might not have been, and maybe I'm wrong, but would not have been invited to otherwise. I was very entertaining. I had a lot of friends, but I always felt like there were 50 couples and me. And at the end of the night, everybody went home to their partner, and I went home to myself.
So in speaking with people over the years, in terms of the narratives that we tell ourselves about how we look, I think it's important that a lot of people could relate to self-consciousness and preoccupation with, am I going to be accepted? And that's not a unique story. I just think that as someone who's so distorted physically, and that's a good word for me to explain, I was distorted physically. I'm over, and you notice Jack is referencing, it gets worse over time, not better. This progressive nature. His mom dies, and it's not I should really get into health. It's I'm going to eat more. I'm going to eat more.
And the society did an interesting thing. I was at a synagogue years ago, and this gentleman that I went to high school with, who I was not close to, came up to me, and appropriate for the day I was there, he said, "I'd like to apologize to you for something." And I said, "Sure. What did you do?" And he said, "In high school, when you came back to school the week after your mom died, I shared a desk with you, and I didn't talk to you for the last 2-3 weeks of the semester." And I said, "As I recall, a lot of people didn't." He said, "I didn't know what to say. I had never met anybody who'd lost a parent. And I was a 17-year-old boy, ignorant. And so I chose to avoid it." And it hit me that developmentally during that time, the thing I needed most, it wasn't available. And same thing with the overeating. A lot of alcoholics I know really can party publicly. I was not. I mean, I did plenty of that, but the worst eating was on my own. And the excuses, I ran into a guy at, again, Temple this year. He had a poker game at his house when we were at UCLA. 7 guys. At about 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, I made up an excuse that I wasn't feeling well. And the reason I made up the excuse is at 10 o'clock at the market at then Pico and Robertson made donuts at 10 o'clock at night, fresh donuts. So I was too sick to continue with the poker game. I went and got in line for the donuts. About 5 minutes later, I see behind me 2 people back, 3 people back, the other obese guy from the poker game who made up the same excuse. And we looked at each other and we did laugh, but it was like we were both lying so that we could get what really we yearned for, which was that.
So for those listening, there's this idea of there's an urgency in I have to eat no matter what. And I want to go back to this narrative because there's an urgency. I have to dedicate so much of my emotional and physical resource to making sure I can eat that way we do. And suffice it to say, for this conversation, I'll speak for both of us. The eating we did, we both don't want to look at the footage of what we did. The best word to describe it is disturbing. If you saw footage of me eating, it wouldn't be pretty for me. It wouldn't be pretty for you. It's a determined, out of control, can't stop experience. Sometimes it could be sprinkled in with grazing. Sometimes people can look. Sometimes we prefer people not to look. But it's a very disturbing experience.
It got to the point where there was a restaurant, it's still there, I think it's Norm's on La Cienega. I'd go there at 10 o'clock at night, tell my dad I still lived at home, tell my dad I was getting the next day's edition of the LA Times. It used to come out at 10 o'clock. So I'd order a bunch of food for the drive home, which it was, at least 5-6 minutes. But I couldn't sit at the table at the counter and wait. I'd order something while I was sitting there that I could get faster while I was waiting for my food to go, which was taking 5 minutes. Immediacy, intense. It was frenetic. It was driven.
So I think of that adolescent self that you have, your adolescent self, and then waking up the next day, right? Having had the experience of, I'm so determined to eat, I have to order before I order so I don't have to sit there, right? How do I show up in the world and not let the consequences of that behavior drown me in self-hatred, right? So that's the narrative.
Yeah.
That's the narrative piece. And I want to share, like, the narrative is also paranoid, because not paranoid in a psychotic way, but I'm wondering what you're thinking. I like to tell a story when I was discovering drive-throughs, and if my mom's listening, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry. The content didn't meet your standards of health or rabbinic supervision. So I discovered cheap drive-through, and I'm just $20 in 1996 goes a long way at the place. And I'm talking to the clown, and I'm ordering all this stuff. And this is really the narrative in terms of how, if someone wants to understand what it's like, for me at least, and I would imagine for other people, to be distorted in the world, and how you experience other people and wondering what they're thinking of you, and how you're so attuned to potentially the threat of other people. I'm ordering all this food, and the clown says to me, "Is that all for you?" And I'm like, "What did you say?" I got so offended. And then the clown said, "Is that all for you?" And what I heard was, "You pig," right? And all they were saying, "Is that all for you? Do you want something else?" And I have a whole story that even the clown is watching me and disgusted by me because I'm disgusted by me.
When you started that story, Adam, I thought you were going to go the route of, and then I ordered all this food and the obligatory Diet Coke. And they'd look at me. I was going to places before there were clowns, and they would look at me, and it was like, it was unspoken. I knew that they knew that was for me. Or I'd make up names with the drive-thrus. This is for Mary, this is for Joe, this is for Steve. And then they get to the drink part, and Mary and Joe and Steve did not care about their drinks. They cared about their food only. So I'd order for 4 or 5 or 6. I went to parts of town. There was the Fat Burger. The first Fat Burger, I think, around LA was over on La Cienega near the Beverly Center. And late at night, it was not safe. It just wasn't safe. And I had to figure out how to go somewhere. And I'm just this pale-faced, flabby-bodied, nerdy Jewish kid. And I had to figure out how to get my fix without, in my fear, getting robbed or killed. And so what I did is I developed a twitch. I mean, I didn't really develop a twitch. I developed a twitch.
Your Twitch persona.
Oh, yeah, my Twitch persona. And I started talking to myself. And what I found, I laugh, but what I found is if you twitch enough and you talk to yourself enough, nobody will bother you. And that's all I wanted. Right. All I wanted was to just get it and go.
So I'm talking to our younger selves, both of us here, and I'm saying we weren't awake. And for me, and I'm sure for you, I was, I had a plethora of meaningful helpers from pediatricians to nutritionists to exercise people to friends to family to neighbors. Everybody wanted to help. And I wasn't awake. I wasn't awake. I had no idea what was going on with me until I was in a field placement. Of course, I go into mental health, right? I was in a field placement and a supervisor said to me, I have an ethical obligation to tell you, you have a problem with food. And I'm like, no shit. And he said, I said, what are you talking? Of course I do. He said, you're an addict. And I said, what are you talking about? I'm not an alcoholic. I said, I have to eat. And he said, not like that. And it was the first time ever I had somewhat of a glimpse of waking up to, I didn't know what was going on. I wasn't awake. I was trying. I didn't want to be so heavy. I didn't want the consequence. I didn't understand. I couldn't make the connection that my relationship with food is impacting my relationship with body. And there is a way that I eat that invites more eating no matter what happens, whether I celebrate or whether I have a tragedy. And this individual, he's since passed away, was the first person to help me. I had a whole neuronal blast.
Well, here's the for those listening, there's another component to this, which is that when I got to UCLA and went on another diet, one of many, I lost 100 pounds. I got a new car. I got a new briefcase. I got a new suit, and I got a new girlfriend. No symptom, no problem. The naivete, and again, I'm intelligent. I'm a graduate of law school. I'm a graduate of UCLA. I'm not stupid. And I joke that I'm the adult child of a Jewish accountant. My dad was bright and a heart of gold, and he had the logic and he had the sincerity, and it just, he couldn't fathom why anybody would do what I was doing. And I looked at him sometimes and said, I don't know either. It was like driven, and there wasn't a lot of support for the notion that it is an addiction. I mean, that's a cop out, and it's too easy, and it's not fact, but that's what it felt like.
So it sounds like both of us have this experience where we're out of control. We don't know why, and we begin the process. And and this is going to tie into my experience professionally, beginning the process of change, which is not an overnight matter. And for me, by the way, even before that individual taught me about, food addiction, right? Which I totally, if you're listening, what we're talking about, the type of gluttony that we're describing is, we're not bad people, right? I'm not a bad person. We're just talking about this. We don't have an on-off switch. And it's our brain gives us great information. It says, hey, I think it's a great idea for you to do X. And once we start, we can't stop. But the idea that for me is it took a long time it took me 6 years after that person introduced the concept of food addiction for me to have an experience where I actually address it. I fought it for a long time. But the beginning of change for me, a good friend of mine at the time said to me, I was smoking, I was drinking, I was out of control. And he said, not like taking care of myself. He said, why don't you just start by brushing your teeth? It was years before. And I remember that was the beginning of doing something differently, being willing to do something differently. In retrospect, that was the beginning of a journey that ultimately 11 years later, right from that moment, it was a process. And I know this isn't the best discussion in terms of managed care, right? But it was a process of letting go and of ideas and arriving at willingness. Do you have a story like that?
Well, a couple things come to mind. First of all, there's a colleague of ours who said that anybody who gets into recovery for an eating disorder might as well accept the fact that they're going to be in therapy for, she said, 7 years. And I thought that's a lousy thing to say from a marketing standpoint or managed care standpoint. But the truth is, to say it's a process is an absolute understatement. Absolutely. There's a great quote that is attributed to Viktor Frankl. And the quote has to do with, there is a gap, a space between stimulus and response. When I was eating, don't get in my way, there's no space. It's boom, boom, or boom.
Immediate.
He said that there is a space between stimulus and response. In that space is an opportunity basically to intervene and to take an action. And with that action comes ultimately our freedom. And again, a lot, you use the word in retrospect. I'm seeing a lot of things in retrospect that when I was in it, and that's where I don't get too hokey, but there's a religious bauble called a dreidel. And the four sides of a dreidel, for those who don't know, it's like a top. Jewish people spin as a game on Hanukkah time. But the four sides of a dreidel have a letter, each side, each one in Hebrew standing for the first letter of a word in a four-word phrase that in that language is Nes Gadol Haya Pa, the great miracle happened here. And I don't know that there's a moment in time for an alcoholic or for overeaters when everything turns. But it is the little things that what do they say? The 12-step people say, one day at a time, the miracle happens. And it does start often by one intervention, like you say, brushing your teeth, making a phone, whatever the intervention is. At that point in time, so my dad would say to me, so let me get this straight. On January 5th, 1982, you could not stop overeating. Yes, Dad. And then a series of events happened on January 6th, 1982. And from then on, you could stop overeating. And I said, yeah. He said, that doesn't make sense. And I said, I absolutely agree. But at that moment in time, things changed. And it was, what's that line about a cucumber? When you come into the recovery, you're like a cucumber. And somewhere along the way, a cucumber can become a pickle. And one thing you know about a pickle is it ain't never going to be a cucumber again. So it passed that line. And like Adam said, you can't get cocky. You can't get arrogant. My recovery, if you will, I've been keeping off about 120, sometimes 110, sometimes 130 for 37 years.
Oh my God.
And that's bizarre to me because at 29 and a half, I had no reason to believe it was ever going to change. I spoke to my sister years later, and she always hoped for the day she turned 45 because our mother died at 44. I didn't think I was going to live that long because 300-pound people again, I didn't have any examples, but 200-pound people that become 300 people don't become 180-pound people. It doesn't happen. 2 becomes 3, becomes 4, and then all hell breaks loose.
I never met anybody either. I was always wondering, who are they? And I never met them. I never met the people who were like me. And I have since, but it is such a rare thing. And so to move this conversation, I think that what we've really touched upon is that both of us have this experience where the alcoholic with alcohol isn't a far reach for us at all. We are the alcoholic with food, right? Once we start, we can't stop, right? I don't know too many of us, and this is just anecdotal. I don't know too many of us who had the burden of 100 pounds or more who are casually doing ice cream and pizza and have kept off their weight for a long time. I just don't know the people. So here I am, in my personal life, I'm like, I get it. I'm an alcoholic with food. No brainer. Whatever they do, I need to do, right? It's involved. Treating alcoholism is involved. There's no way that a guy like me can, do a once every week or 2 week situation with a nutritionist, see a doctor once every 3 months and call it a day. It is involved to treat what I have. It's involved. It involves, there's an emotional component. There's a spiritual component. There's a communal component. There's a whole aspect of mind, body, and spirit that must be incorporated into my life.
But I don't think people want to see that because it's not romantic, it's not sexy, and it takes a ton of work, no pun intended, it takes a lot of work. And I don't think people who are overweight generally I don't think they can conceptualize what it takes. It's not about going to a dietitian and learning that less salad dressing means less calories. For many, it is. It's just they need information. They take the information, they grab it and run.
Yes, many of us, as you say this, many of us who I've met could open our own, nutrition clinic. People I know have hordes of information about nutrition and nutritional content. So it isn't about, it's not exclusively, it's not certainly not exclusively about content, right? Because we're, like you're saying, people aren't, it's not an issue of intelligence, right? It has nothing, just like alcoholics, I wouldn't say as a community, alcoholics have less intelligence, right? So it's not an informational thing. And I agree with you. It's not sexy to have to do all these things. So let's move into this. So both of us have this experience, personal experience. In the world we go, I'm a psychologist, you're an LMFT, a licensed marriage and family therapist. And, I want to help, right? And I want to say, we spoke about this before, I also want to be open-minded. I want to be open-minded and say, just because I have a certain experience doesn't mean I need to bring that on you. I'm open to different experiences up to and including gastric bypass surgery, right? It's not my place to be the arbiter of what works and what doesn't. However, right? A big however, I'm watching a sea of different specialists trying to help. And I don't, just like when I was a kid, right? I don't find people arriving at health. What's your experience?
The exact same. I think compulsive eaters, it's really, really tough. And most people don't have the patience. Most of us don't have the patience, the willingness, and to be practical, if you're talking about therapy, either the insurance or the money to make an investment in long-term stuff. That's why the fact that there are community resources that are free are helpful. I think people need. I heard a doctor, a local addiction specialist, Matt Torrington, years
Sure.
ago, talk about. He says that the medical profession, the psychiatric profession, can do a lot to help recovering addicts and alcoholics. But he says, in his experience, and he's not a recovering guy, I don't think. I mean, none of my business. But what he said was, there's two things that the medical community cannot give that recovering alcoholic addicts must have. And that was spirituality and community. And I think community is real important. And the last thing I, as an ex-fat guy, wanted was to sit around with a bunch of other people. I went to Weight Watchers. I really did. I know you'll edit this out, I'm sure, but I have fun with the line. I went to Weight Watchers once, and in 2 weeks, I lost 14 days. It's not a put down of that. It's just when it's treated simplistically they have first order change and second order change. First order change being just physical. I mean, it's not core change. It's like if you put on a suit right now, you'd still be Adam Silberstein with a suit. You wouldn't be any different. But when somebody really changes, that becomes second order change, core organic change.
The pickle.
It's never going to be a cucumber again unless somebody transitions into that state of emotional, psychological, spiritual existence. And I'm not being silly or woo-woo at all, but unless they get it, for the hardcore compulsive overeater, in my experience, the likelihood of getting and staying near a goal weight is really, really tough. Now, I know there are organizations and beliefs and groups that talk about being healthy no matter what the weight is. Absolutely. And to not shame somebody because of that. That's imperative. It doesn't merit shame. You said it's not a moral issue. It's not it's not about being good or being bad. It's having that disease. I'm fine with the disease model. In fact, I was jokingly lecturing it 35 years ago with disease just means no ease. Somebody who had ease wouldn't be eating the way I was eating. And I like the addiction model, whether it's scientifically valid or for a body of people that I've met over the last 37 years. It's really a good orientation. It's a really good orientation to adopt, to consider it a disease, see the addiction wheel, if you will, which generally is described as having, there is an obsession, a thought process, and I thought about it 24/7. There's a behavioral component, is to get the food. And then there's the resulting feelings, which is to feel really crappy. And it's like a little choo-choo train on a little rail. I think it, I act on it, I feel lousy. And when I feel lousy, all I can think about is soothing. And the food soothes.
So that's the disease model. So in walks a person to our office, right? And we're here to help, right? And we have an experience, and both of us do a lot of work in general with addiction, right? And I think our experience really helps us, right, with substances or with other process addictions. And somebody comes in, a person well over 100 pounds, and they've been privy to countless people and countless ideas telling them, healthy at all sizes, telling them, very low calorie restrictive diets. They've been often, through a whole chain of institutions and providers, medical, psychiatric, therapists, exercise nutritionists, and everybody has a different idea. And they come and you introduce the medical, a disease model, and then they say, but I have to eat. I have to eat. And I'm confused. I'm so confused. What are you talking about? What does it mean? Because I'm not, you go to let's have this discussion with the alcoholic and then say, okay, you're going to drink 3 times a day, 4 times a day. Right. So I'm sure we both have this experience where this becomes a discussion. How do I eat and not engage in the behavior?
And I think it's made more difficult when we try to use the 12 steps for overeaters because of, I think it's the second to the last paragraph in the AA people's big book, that working the remaining 11 steps means the adoption of actions and attitudes that almost no alcoholic who is still drinking would think of taking. So the alcoholic has to take out, they're stuck with the obsession and they're stuck with the feeling shitty if they drink. But the behavioral component is the one that can be intervened, which is to stop drinking. Now, I know it's not quid pro quo with eating because we have to eat. But I've seen a lot of people who have adopted the notion that, let's say they eat 3 times a day. Let's say physiologically for them, it's acceptable to eat 3 times a day. When they get hungry an hour or 2 or 3 after breakfast, the notion is, can they, like Frankel said, put a space between that stimulus, I'm hungry, and eating, which is the response? Can they put an action in there, which may be to meditate? It may be to write. I like the tool of writing. If it's not hunger, what am I hungry about right now? And then if they want to eat afterwards, I can't stop. I'm not trying to stop them. I'm trying to get them to stop for a moment and try to see what's going on at a deeper level.
And in the space of stimulus response, right, I could create or be in partnership somehow with life, with nature, with whatever you want to call it, a way to create freedom. And freedom would be, I am having a sober experience around my food. I'm having a sober experience, and the word sober is so different than the word abstinent. I'm not just cutting off. It's not just self-sacrifice. I'm having freedom. I'm having the word, if you look it up in the dictionary, sober has an element of calm, connected, right? What, my new experience, this new person, right? I am having an experience of calm with this substance that I have, food.
And there's a lot of people in the eating disorder world, and I understand it, who really don't like the notion, for example, of people abstaining from any one type of food. I understand that. For some people, though, as long as it's on the table as an option, I'm going to obsess about that option. If it's not an option, it's not a problem. Now, is that optimal in recovery? You tell me. I don't know. For some, they have found that if they don't eat, fill in the blank, they do better. For example, I don't eat glaring, blatant sugar for 37 years. I don't miss it. I don't think my eating would qualify as disordered now. I don't feel like a restrictor. I certainly don't look like a restrictor. I eat. I go to restaurants. I don't. I walk into any restaurant, and I feel free. But like you say, I'm doing myself a favor by not eating sugar. I don't miss it. I don't miss it at all.
And as professionals, I think that what we're open to is the idea of that there's a unique experience for each individual. What freedom for me right? Freedom for me may be different than freedom from you, for you.
Absolutely.
And that our job is not to determine for the individual what freedom is. It's more to provide an education and a plethora of options. But I think that if you're reflecting on our conversation, what's important is whatever it's going to be, whatever you do, it's going to be involved. It's going to be, it's not going to be sexy. It's not always going to be fun. And it's going to have a dimension of tools, mind, body, spirit, between the stimulus and the response, as you say, that will, so when I am feeling unsettled, right, my usual go-to is food. Now I'm going to have other go-tos, and it may be community, support, it may be reading stuff, it may be writing, it may be helping, it may be a whole lot of different things, but I'm going to have to employ those things. And I guess our job is to help people in a process. There's a model called the trans-theoretical model, which is, it's a process. And I may, just like if I look at my experience, first I'm open to the idea that it may be true, but I resist it, right? I get a little closer, I get a little farther, right? I'm in this, I go from, I don't have a problem, pre-contemplation to contemplation, maybe I do, to action, maybe back to pre-contemplation, this is all bullshit, right? And as a therapist in this, sitting in the room with somebody, my job is to patiently, non-judgmentally, compassionately, right, guide people, help, or bear witness and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing, right? This is what I'm seeing.
That's
right?
that's. By the way, there was a book, I imagine it was in the 70s, called "If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him." I thought, what an absurd title, but there is a paragraph in there, and in what little OCD mindset I have, I think it's page 188 or 192. It's one of those pages. There's a paragraph that says, "The Buddhahood in each of us has already been obtained. We need only recognize it." So if you meet the guru that tells you, like Adam, you just said a therapist should not do, what your truth is or what you should do, they say, run the other way. But they also say that that wisdom, that Buddhahood, exists in each of us. And part of the therapist's job is to hold the flashlight to the seeker and help them find their own truth.
How am I going to accept the Buddha in me and accept what freedom looks like? And on some level, I agree with you. Inherently, right, armed with certain information, because I wasn't awake until I was awake, armed with certain information and personal responsibility and maturity, right? Because part of this is growing up, right? And a willingness to not pretend that my actions don't have consequences.
Well, a lot of us, I was stunted at 14, I think as a compulsive overeater. And then when my mom died, nailed it. But I was stuck. So when I went into what I call recovery, 15 years later, I was 29 and a half with, at best, the developmental maturity of a 14-year-old.
I often say that addiction to me in general is an adolescent condition. There's a lot of wishful thinking and determined conviction. I can beat the game, which very much parallels to me high school or even younger. So in that, I agree with you. I'm not here to say what freedom is for you. And it could be, right? It could be for some individuals that the road to freedom is going to be the road of surgery, right?
Sure.
It's going to be that I'm electing to save my life, right? I'm dying here and I'm going to get a surgery. I'm going to alter myself. And then I'm willing, and I've seen it before, and I'm willing to embrace and adapt lifestyle changes, mind, body, spirit, right? All the ingredients that we speak about, right? Employing all the interventions, even if it involves surgical intervention. I've seen it, people going to church, right? Church is an intervention. I'm really, really wanting to dedicate myself spiritually. This is getting in the way of my spiritual practice. And I'd like to use my spiritual community as a resource. So I'm not going to define, but I do think it's important though to look at this. If I want to have an experience, I'm much more interested in people who have done it before me.
Sure.
Right? So what's working for people? And my challenge with the community at large is, like you said, 1 in 400 are having the experience of long-term maintenance. And that sounds crazy, but I want people to think about it. How many people do you know who were once morbidly obese, who haven't been for a long time? And morbidly obese it's not just I have a few pounds to lose. It's a really, 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 really distorted experience, right? It's very heavy and it's hard to sell that medically. I mean, if I speak to an internist or I speak to, my wife is an, OBGYN and my brother and my father, I come from a family of doctors, right? I don't, it's easy to target them and say, oh, they're just biased, they're fattists and so forth. But when it comes to surgical complication, it comes to diabetes, it comes to heart conditions, right? There's definitely a correlation and a strong connection between how I treat my body and disease. So there's an element of responsibility, but however you want to arrive at freedom, right? What it is for you, I feel like it's our job to be open to any experience.
It's hard. I had a debate many, many years ago. I was contacted by a treatment facility, and they wanted me to have a debate because they wanted me to speak and they wanted their director to speak. So we had to come up with a topic, and we wound up talking about bariatric surgery, pro and con. And I said I would participate in it if I was con. So I listened to him. We had a debate, and I was atypical. Well, maybe not. I was merciless because the audience was mostly therapists, many of whom were in their own recovery. And I said to this gentleman, let me get this straight. This person cannot stop overeating. They have surgery to make their stomach smaller so they can't hold as much. And now they have a physical solution to what isn't a physical problem. But he said, well, what happens if they get full faster? I said, I never stopped because I was full. Well, they're not as hungry as much. I never ate because I was hungry. There was no correlation. In fact, there's a great scene in a movie, Other People's Money. Danny DeVito is sitting behind a huge desk, and instead of a candy dish, he's got a donut dish. And he offers these two attractive actress-type women come in, and he offers them a donut. And one of them thinks and says, no, thank you, I'm not hungry. And DeVito goes, hunger? Donuts? What do they have to do with each other? Even there's no correlation. So I argued enthusiastically against, because if I would have gone that route, I would have made the same promises. I would have nodded my head yes to all the things I was told I'd have to do afterwards that I know in my heart I would not do. I mean, I had knee surgery years ago and elbow surgery a couple of years ago, and I was told what you must do by way of physical therapy. I know I rolled the dice. I know I took a risk. I know it wasn't smart, but I did not adhere to the totality of the treatment plan. And my right arm is better than it ever was. My left knee is fine. With this stuff, you can't do that because just because the stomach's smaller or you'll throw up if you eat, that's not correlated with stopping a compulsive overeater.
So in the room with the individual, right? They're going to do what they're going to do, but also I'm open to the idea that this could arrest the condition for some people. But for me, right, and I think what I would want to arrive at with the person who comes to see me is, do you know the experience of once you start, you can't stop, with certainly with certain foods? And if so, right, have you ever like me, have you ever contemplated the idea that that's a form of alcoholism for you? Right? And I think what in watching people, again, it's you were saying 7 years in this long process of I'm a mirror and saying, here's what I'm noticing. Are you having this experience in collaboration with the individual, right? Do you have this experience with sugar? Do you have this experience with bread, with fried foods, where once you start, you can't stop? And are you open to a addiction treatment model, right? That's one. And some people are and some people aren't. But and it's I'm not going to throw everybody in that world, but I also think I'm not going to throw everybody in the category addict, but I think it's also important there's an energy of anti-food addiction. And are you kidding? Right? So if you go to 12-step programs, you're going to meet people. If you're listening and you've grappled with and suffered morbid obesity, if you want to meet people who have the experience of once being morbidly obese and now aren't. You're going to find them, right? That you'd never, and when I say that, you'd never know by looking at them that they once carried all this extra weight. And that's an important, I wouldn't want to dismiss that and say that's contraindicated and harmful. Right. And sometimes I get met with, oh, how could you dare say that to somebody? You're just going to aggravate their problem. And I'm thinking to myself, well, whatever's going on out there isn't helping their problem either. Find people who have the experience if you identify.
And see, you, Adam, and I think, well, like you said, without being arrogant and egotistical, are offering an alternative schema at which to look at this, because mainstream dietitians and many therapists, they're not big on the notion of this. They're not big on, many of them are not even big on anybody with an eating disorder utilizing a 12-step program. The abstinence model is verboten in their world, and I'm not minimizing the value of what they believe.
Including medication, meaning we're not sitting here, we don't take it, but if somebody needs a medication aid for mental health, we refer. If someone needs a medication aid for appetite, I don't think that as professionals, right? As professionals, we're going to say one thing no, one thing yes. We're not going to do any of that.
I think we have an obligation not to. Absolutely.
And we're going to say what is going to produce freedom for you, true freedom, mature, true freedom. Freedom from food, freedom from this food issue you have. What is going to move you in the direction of freedom?
Another thing that's not sexy is you use the word responsibility. I think for addicts of all types, the road less traveled talked about kids can't defer gratification. They can't delay gratification. Adults, in theory, can. Addicts, I would think, would fall more in the description of the kids in that book. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So we've been talking, and I think we have similar ideas, but I want to sort of offer hope. I don't want to leave this conversation where people are hearing like dread.
In fact, I'm glad you're going to address that. I have nothing but hope. I think that miracle that I alluded to about the dreidel, it's not limited in number. It's not percentages. It's available to everybody and anybody. And again, it's not about intelligence. It's not about good looks. It's not about money or earning it or deserving it. Those for whom, I know it's not a scientific model, but those for whom that miracle happens, that switch happens, that core change happens, it's not zero sum. I can have it and you can have it.
And it's not going to happen overnight.
Yes.
And it's not going to, the theme of this podcast is getting better. So let me be responsible with what getting better with Dr. Adam is the podcast. What does it mean to get better? It may mean that you have to spend a long time, like I did, challenging status quo, challenging nature, and saying I can do it differently before one is willing to change. And that for me, the supports I had along the way, the people who were my mirrors and said, let me show you what I'm seeing. I love you. I'm not shaming you. Here's what I'm seeing. Help me arrive at a place where I finally did have the experience you're talking about of a miracle. And I see it in my own practice. I see people grappling with food or grappling with substance. And if there's a commitment, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a struggle along the way, but there's so much hope for anybody willing to stay engaged in the process, right?
I'm thinking of two clients right now, two male clients, both of whom, ex-clients, clients, that have lost in the ballpark between 100 and 150 pounds and are keeping it off one day at a time, slowly. Okay. One of them is in a 12-step program and very much adhering to most of the suggestions. The other one, I never would have mentioned 12-step programs to. He wouldn't have gone. Older guy who's still maintaining the 150-pound weight loss, and he has put together a regimen that for him absolutely has worked with no 12-step program.
And is involved.
It's
mature.
Absolutely. The other thing is I for some reason have a proclivity to remember unusual quotes. There's a book called Change by a guy named Vaslovic. And in that book, I had to read it. I think the first year it was required reading. The second year it was suggested reading. By the third year, I think they would have been fine if I never even had bought it. But it goes, It depends on whether we see ourselves as pawns in a game whose rules we call reality, or as players of the game, proactive players of the game who know that the rules are real only to the extent that we've accepted them and we can change them. So the rule is that most fat people don't get out of that condition. That might be the statistics, but there is no reason. It's not hardwired that way. It's not like you're limited to being fat if you've ever wore. I know the genes, the fat, the things they stay. I understand all that.
You understand all the obstacles.
You bet.
Yes.
And there are plenty of concrete, real obstacles. That being said, the example I used from that quote is Muggsy Bogues. You know who he is? Sure. He probably was told that 5'3", 5'4" guys.
For those listening, Muggsy Bogues was an NBA player who
for
was
many years.
5'3".
Okay, so he probably was told, "You're 5'3", don't play basketball, you idiot." And he probably heard that a lot, and he said, "That's nice. I hear it." That's the main mentality. And he had a very, very successful and long career. The other example I used in all candor is Barack Obama. I imagine early on, he might have heard some flack that as an African American, you're not limited, but you sure as hell can't be president. He probably did hear that. And apparently he decided, that's nice, that's interesting, I don't care. And he was able to transcend or trump the limitations because they're not hardwired limitations. Either are ours as compulsive overeaters.
So if we're speaking to the former selves, our cucumbers, if we're speaking to someone who's in the throes of morbid obesity, eating in that disturbing way, what I would want to say to that individual is breathe. Don't be hard on yourself.
Yes.
That's not going to help, right? A whipping board won't help.
You can't beat somebody into...
Find somebody, right? And it doesn't have to be a therapist, who you can be entirely honest with. I mean, entirely, right? And where you could admit and accept, right? I have a problem and I feel helpless. That's the beginning. At this, if you're where I was, that there's people and supports in your life, and I did have this in retrospect, people who I got to share with, where I got to say, I'm hurting. I got to be honest with you. I'm not celebrating this. This hurts.
You know what I just realized, Adam, that it makes this even worse? Trust versus mistrust is the developmental task of a very early developmental stage. I think it's 0 to 12 months. So we've made the decision to not trust. And that notion that you're proposing about being open and honest is imperative, but challenging.
So trust versus mistrust, for those listening, refers to a developmental stage by Erickson, the famous developmental theory, where individuals can start to trust their caretaker and share. And when you don't trust, there's a form of isolation. And I believe, in terms of my own clinical understanding, that most symptoms are bred from isolation, a form of being separate from you. So what I'm talking about in the beginning is I'm not even talking about making a change. I'm talking about a concrete change. I'm talking about pre-concrete change, a willingness to come out of isolation. For me, it's being able to say to somebody, I hurt, and listening, and the willingness to brush my teeth long before my food changed. A willingness to come out of isolation, have a shared human-to-human interactions where I get to be me, hurt, warts and all, right? And I begin to have relationships where I don't have to pretend and hide. That to me is a great beginning. Different than you might hear from a nutritionist or an MD saying, hey, your blood pressure is high or your diabetes are out of control. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do anything, but the beginning of this change for me has to start with that safety and trust and willingness to be honest. And that requires from me, right? It requires from me a willingness also to put myself out and be vulnerable.
Many years ago, there was an article in the LA Times about a Project 10 at Fairfax High School, which was started by a woman named Virginia Uribe, who was a teacher there when I went to Fairfax. She started an organization, a support group for kids that were gay. And I wrote her a letter after I saw that saying, My issue was a different issue, but I was totally isolated, especially when my mom died. But even leading up to that, being obese, I wish somebody had done for my populations what you have so artistically done for a population. And she was very loving and responsive to having a fellowship, if you will, a community.
To be safe, to have an identification and a safety to share. And I think you're right. I think that this is not unique to our issue. I think it's to any struggle, the ability to have people in my life where I don't have to put on airs and wear costumes and masks. I get to be who I am and be safe in sharing. This has been a really, really special podcast for me. I so appreciate you coming and sharing with me just in this way. It was very, very, I think it would be very helpful.
I'm impressed with your willingness to have a podcast like this. I very much appreciate the forum to tell what I believe is not a route to recovery, but also to be considered a schema that merits being considered for those for whom it could help or it could work.
So in conclusion, for those listening, Jack Soll practices here on the West Side. He is a psychotherapist, but he definitely is someone who works in the field of eating disorders with any eating struggle as well as compulsive overeating. How do we reach you?
Either by my phone number at the office, which is 310-471-2210. I'm in Brentwood on San Vicente near Bundy. You can reach out if they prefer it. They can contact me by email, which would be J like in Jack, N like in Nelson, Soll, my last name, SOLL, @ but you can't laugh, AOL.com. I'm one of 9 people left in the world that still uses AOL. Either way, yeah, I would love to hear from you, talk to you, and I would not be anything but a potential resource should you choose to talk to me. I can make suggestions, give you ideas. We can brainstorm on the phone, meet, whatever's best for you. I just enjoy being of service that way.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Adam.
This podcast is for general information and entertainment purposes only. This should not be considered treatment advice, nor is it a substitute for an individual treatment plan. If you have questions or concerns about your individual situation, it is strongly recommended you consult a licensed professional to talk about things that are specific to you. If there's an emergency, it is strongly recommended you seek treatment at your nearest emergency room.